Hello, everybody. My name is Danielle Dionne, and I'm with No Violence for Kids Canada. Today, we have an extra special guest coming in all the way from Australia. Laetitia Greeff and I met over LinkedIn, funny enough. I just kept following her posts and was so inspired by her amazing legal research around corporal punishment. And so in a moment, I'm going to introduce Laetitia, and we're going to talk a lot about law reform and research and see if there's any ways that Canada and Australia can come together to ban corporal punishment against children. Before we get started, I do want to acknowledge that I am on the land, the traditional territory of the Kwantlen people. And the Kwantlen people really value community and gathering and the environment. And their spirit is about making the world a better place. And I acknowledge their truth. I believe in their truth that colonization is an ongoing process. And in that, I do have a responsibility towards reconciliation. I take that responsibility really seriously, and my work is all around ending violence against children. And so in doing that, I am urging and asking for the government of Canada to announce a repeal of Section 43 now. We need to pass Bill S-251 immediately, and we have no time to waste. Kids today in Canada are experiencing violence at an increasing rate. So it's time that we act and stand up and make a change, and we must change the law right away. So to get started, I always get started by saying my favorite quote by Fred Rogers. Anyone who helps a child in their life is a hero of mine. And today I get to meet another hero. So I'm going to introduce Laetitia Greeff. Dr. Greeff earned a Master's of Law, and her dissertation was a comparative legal study of corporal punishment. And she was looking at South Africa and Australia and the differences between those types of reform to find out really what could work best in Australia. Laetitia is an activist for children, and she also works with an organization that I didn't write down, Laetitia. It is End Corporal Punishment of Children of Australia, ECAP.
End Physical Punishment of Australian Children.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being here, Laetitia.
Thank you, Danielle, for that very kind introduction. I would like to take this opportunity to pay my respects to the elders, past and present, and the traditional owners of the land that I'm on. This is the Darking Young People land, and they are the custodians of this land. And this is Aboriginal land, always was and always will be.
That's fascinating to hear both of us as settlers doing our white responsibility thing, hey?
Absolutely.
Coming together, looking at the intersections of violence against children and understanding how colonization has brought this to our lands and taking that responsibility. I know both of us in our conversations online and even just before this video, we have a lot in common and definitely a big shared passion. I'm so interested in the papers that you've been working on and taking that legal lens. So reform, law reform, after all the conversations, people wonder, are we going to get a new program? What can we do to help kids? And it always comes down to legislative reform. However, how do we get people to rise up and do this work? I mean, I'm in it with you. And so let's start by I want to know about how you got here. How did you get into this work?
Well, corporal punishment wasn't really part of my studies or even on my radar until 2007 when I started my master's degree. And at that point, New Zealand was passing legislation to prohibit corporal punishment. And South Africa had just recently passed the Children's Act of 2005.
Right.
So I was looking around me, and these are neighbours to our left and right here in Australia. And I see there's movement in the children's rights domain. But in Australia, there wasn't that much movement. We were a little bit stuck in the past. And so I wanted to study and understand why is it so difficult for us to make law reform an issue with regards to corporal punishment. So this is where I started back in 2007, my very first introduction to corporal punishment and the research surrounding that issue.
Okay. So it sounds like it was around wondering more about like how you can bring in some legislation around the rights of children. And that
It
got
was
you curious?
Well, for me, it was more, I was trying to understand why aren't we moving? What is holding us back? If everybody around us are starting to focus on children's rights and putting children first, what is holding us back? Why is corporal punishment still a big thing here? Why is it still legal in every state and territory? In every home in Australia, it is legal for you to smack your child. And for me, it was more of an understanding. The desire to understand the mechanics behind it only started when I was doing my doctorate, when I wanted to understand how the legislation would work. But initially, it was more of a moral question, which morphed into, well, let's see what the mechanics looks like and see how we can work around that.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. It's funny when we talk to other people that understand that it's still legal to hit kids in Australia and Canada and many other countries in the world. It's almost like, what? There's a shock. We know it hurts them, right? So you started your doctorate and then you were looking more at the mechanics of like, why is this still legal? And what is your findings on that? Why is it still legal?
Well, we have, just like Canada, we're a former British colony, and we are a little bit stuck with a lot of British rules, and some of them just aren't fit for purpose anymore, and we need to move with the times. And so it is getting our politicians and the elected officials to understand that we have to move with the times. And for us here, it's a little bit of a slow process. Politicians in particular are very scared to interfere with what's happening in the home and don't want to make waves when it comes to parenting. They want to trust that parents know what they're doing. But having said that, we know with domestic violence rates being as high as they are, we cannot always trust that parents are acting in the best interests of children. So sometimes, you got to be brave and you've got to just say, we need to change this law. We need to protect our children and we have to put them first. And this is why our campaign is so important. We're trying to get people motivated and mobilized. And part of that process is talking to politicians, writing letters to politicians. There is some ferocious letter writing happening here. I tell you, we've got draft letters that we are ready to send out to people. We just copy and you can send them to your MP or your local representative, or that's on the cards. We'll be making that available within the next week or so. So this is what we want to do. We want to get people motivated and acting and realizing that we need change. But of course, part of this motivation is an education process. Well, like you said, many people can't believe that corporal punishment is still legal. And then by the same token, if you tell them, well, we want to change that, they say, whoa, I don't want you interfering in my home life, So for us, it's important. This mobilization goes in hand with education.
Absolutely.
That's where we are with our advocacy.
When I asked you what is the fix, it's interesting you started right away with recognizing how we're both under this British rule and we're still stuck back in the day. Our Section 43 here in Canada is in our criminal code, and it was enacted in 1892, which is back, just a few years before the residential institutions were brought in here. And I know similarly to Australia, the residential institutions there and same thing. I mean, the colonization happened nearly around all of that same time. And our laws are similar. We have a comparative legal, I guess, enactment. Your Crimes Act, our criminal code, very much protected perpetrators, right? And at the time. at the time. And children and women were chattels in those laws. And so I do see how, that unpacking has to happen. And also recognizing how education is really important, because I think what came up for me when you said that, we're in a modern world. A lot of people here in Canada, and I'm curious about in Australia, think that it's illegal to hit kids. They're shocked to find out about, that there is child abuse happening here, but there's a criminal sanction and it's private. So people don't hear about it. And unless you're working in the front lines, and you do, is that what's happening there? Like, how do we get people over the line of just thinking that it's legal because it's illegal, because that's where we are in society? It's obvious, it hurts kids, but our laws are so archaic.
I know it is one of the challenges that we face. As being part of a former British colony, is that we have to kind of change the mentality of the whole country, but we have to be very diplomatic about how we go about doing this. And so, yes, I agree. Colonization did bring a bit of heartache with it. And this was one of those things that I wish we never had, Corporal punishment is such a demeaning way. It is awful. But how we move forward is going to depend on how the general population reacts to this proposal that we change. And I'm hoping that with education, we can convince them that our children deserve better, and they deserve better treatment. They deserve equal treatment. Assault is assault, whether you attack an adult or whether you attack a child. There should be no difference. And, a 17-year-old boy who is 364 days after his 17th birthday, compared with an 18-year-old boy who's 1 day after his 18th birthday, they get treated so differently, and their birthdays are 2 days apart.
Yeah.
How does that work? That just makes no sense.
Yeah.
So yes, we have a little bit of a challenge ahead of us, especially in Australia. It's a little bit more complex because we do not have one criminal law. So we have to put a little bit more effort into the process here. But I'll talk about that a little bit later.
I'm interested to hear where you're going with that. So in our previous conversation, when I was doing my research on your research, I'm looking at your papers, and I know I'm going to be using you in my citations coming up. Thank you. One of the things that I was fascinated about with Australia in comparison to Canada is Australia doesn't have a Bill of Rights.
Yes, that is a little bit of a problem. Yes.
How little?
The only Western democracy to not have a Bill of Rights. Isn't that a shame? Yes. So the rationale behind that is because we took most of our human rights from Britain and copied what they did. We have separate acts, the Racial Discrimination Act, the Disability Act, and so forth. So we have these separate acts, and our government has decided, well, that is enough protection for now. We don't need one Bill of Rights that combines all these separate different acts in one. And that is part of our British legacy that we inherited from them, because we just copied what they did. And even they have a Bill of Rights now, we are still stuck without one because the government thinks that having separate separate acts is equivalent to having a Bill of Rights. Right. But there is movement. I can guarantee you it's not like everybody's just accepted that point of view. There is a lot of movement, and all I can say is watch this space.
I'm excited. That sounds great. I'm imagining there must be some movement towards an actual Bill of Rights. That brings me to my next curiosity. In the differences too, is what I was noticing is just thinking about the difference between a judicial review and a parliamentary process. And I think that could be really helpful for our viewers to understand, like law reform. We hear in courts and court decisions and precedent can be set, but those decisions are based on constitution, which can also be something that might need a little decolonization. So then there's parliamentary process, and here that is the ruling power. So what's that like in Australia? Can you tell me more about the differences between the two? Because I'm not the scholar. I'm learning. I'm learning.
All right. So a judicial review is where you take an act to court and you ask the court to have a look at this act or the statute, and you say it is no longer fit for purpose. It breaches certain human rights, and we need to get rid of this act or this statute. And then the court will typically say, right, I agree with you, and it gets struck out. And that is how law reform happens through judicial review. So the judges make a new law then, basically by removing the old statute or the old provision in the law. So people have a bit of an issue with that because they feel that judges are not elected officials and they shouldn't be making law. So that's a bit of an issue. So ideally, with corporal punishment or really any law that you are going to make through judicial review, you have to follow it up with a law that went through Parliament, that was debated and public was brought along with them, and there was, public debate, and there was debate in Parliament, and so it's gone through all the rigors that a law should go through. So that is judicial review. And then the parliamentary processes are what you are doing right there in Canada. It's a bill that gets debated, it gets tabled, and everybody is aware of it. So you take the whole country with you, and it's democratically decided if this bill should pass and become law. So that is the difference between judicial review and parliamentary processes. So parliamentary processes always wins out. You still have, even if you have a judicial review, you still have to make a law to follow that up, to enshrine that into the country's, legal system. But yes, in Australia, for us, it seems like the parliamentary process is the one that we're aiming for, because the other one, judicial review, is not something that's viable for us here in Australia, because we have 8 jurisdictions and it's a bit tricky and complicated, and you have to start with strategic litigation. Sorry. And yes, and that requires a lot of mobilization and money and effort and money, and any kind of law reform where you want to do something as controversial as this is going to require a lot of time and money and effort and money. So I can't emphasize I can't emphasize that enough. You can talk to any advocacy group. They're always looking for contributions. And so this is the difference that we have. And in Australia, we're aiming for the parliamentary process.
So is that parliamentary process? Can you tell me more? When am I reading S50? And then you mentioned also S61AA, I guess the Tasmanian Commission put those forward in 2001. What is all that about?
Okay, so those are, so we have 8 jurisdictions in Australia. We have 6 states and 2 territories. Now, you've got to stay on top of this. We have some states who have enshrined the defense of reasonable chastisement into their criminal system, into their criminal laws. And then we have states that have continued on with their common law defense of reasonable chastisement. So it's not enshrined into a criminal statute. So what we have to do here in Australia is the section 61AA that you mentioned, that applies to New South Wales, and that is where the defence has been codified in New South Wales in the criminal law. So Section 50 refers to Tasmania, where that has been enshrined in the Tasmanian Criminal Code. And then you have the 3 states, Victoria, the ACT, and South Australia, who apply the common law, and the rest of the country, Queensland, Northern Territory, Western Australia, Tasmania, and New South Wales, they're all using the criminal law to, to further this defense.
Thank you. That makes sense, because when I saw that, I was like, how come there's 2? What's going on? I must ask Laetitia, right? And I was looking at the structure of the legal system, and I was like, okay, yeah, there's commonalities and there's differences.
It's very complex.
It is complicated. You're right. And I'm glad that I get to learn from you. I mean, thank you for answering all my questions. I have so many. I want to ask more, if we could spend some time on something where both is really important to us. In order to move this bill in Canada and in the United States, we need people to come together. This whole idea of othering and division, and is it good, is it bad, is really standing in the way for here, and I'm sure they're having these conversations. It's so important that, because the bill to ban corporal punishment is compassion for children, that this bill and this legal reform needs to be compassionate for parents and compassion for everybody along the way. What is your advice? How do we bring people together? What do we have to be careful of here?
That's a very good question. And it makes me a little bit emotional to talk about it, because corporal punishment has been part of a large group of people. You know, a large part of your population grew up with corporal punishment. And just watching your interview with Ron, I was struck by the fact that he said people don't want to join the joint statement because they don't want to offend their parents, or they're looking back to what their parents did, and they don't want to create division within their families or in their corporations or, you know, their companies, their organizations. And I think that is what we have to recognize. Yes, we want to move forward, but we have to tread carefully, and we have to understand that for a lot of people, this is a very, very complicated issue, one where they want to move forward, but without hurting the people that they care the most about. They don't want to be judgmental. And I want to emphasize that removing the defense of reasonable chastisement does not carry a judgment with it. There's no judgment. We just want to show that children deserve equal treatment to adults, and that, yes, we may have been corporally punished. We may ourselves have dished out a few smacks, but there is no judgment. And we understand people come from different backgrounds, different histories. A lot of people have a lot of baggage and come from broken homes. And so we want to educate, we want to help, we want to support.
Yeah.
And we want to move forward with putting our children first and showing them a way where violence is not part of your life.
So important. Thank you so much, Laetitia, for bringing that lens to this conversation. I can't agree more. Kids need compassionate systems that support their parents under any circumstance. If we really want to put kids first, our systems have to care for their parents gently, compassionately, lovingly. And so this is not a bill to make people feel bad in Canada, and I can hear in Australia, and I'm so happy to hear that. It's Dr. Joan Durant talked a lot about in her book. I'm glad you just ordered it. Everybody out there, you should look at this book. It's called Decolonizing Discipline. It's super good. And there's a piece in that book that was really moving for me, and it was the story of seatbelts here in Canada. You know, what happened then. Back in the day, I grew up in the back of a pickup truck. I mean, that was the way it was, right? There was, all of this old school kind of parenting back then. I didn't know it was wrong or dangerous, but then the law changed. The law changed because it was unsafe for children, right? So we think about what happens now if a parent is pulled over and a child's in the back seat without a seatbelt. At no point are they going to be pulled out of the car in front of the child, storm down into the jailhouse, right, and be, given one of those. There's systems that will support that situation in order to put, the care of the child. And I hope that's the best outcome possible. Section 43 in Canada is pivotal. In talking to Gillian Van Turnout, who was a senator in Ireland, I talked to her about the aftermath of what we can expect. How is this going to make society better? And I'm curious about what your thoughts are in Australia. What might happen after?
Well, apart from the fact that we'll have it formally repealed in some states and illegal countrywide, hopefully, if all states do manage to end corporal punishment, I think it's going to take time to actually eradicate corporal punishment altogether. From my research, I can tell you that some countries to this day that have prohibited corporal punishment struggle with the numbers that are still occurring. And so I don't think we should be unrealistic about this. It's going to take time, and education needs to happen continuously. It's not something that stops the minute the bill is signed or the minute that one of our states, repeals this offending legislation.
Yeah.
It's a continuous process. And I think, a review every 5 or 10 years will be a good thing. So we can, it's like a health check. Let's see how the country is doing and where can we do better. And do we need more education? Do we need to put more efforts into, I don't know, even when parents discover that they're pregnant, do we start then? Start educating then? Or do we wait until they start preschool or kindergarten? Or, so I think we have to, once we have that in place where corporal punishment should no longer be administered, then education should just continue 5-10 years down the track. We do a review, we see where we're at. We can even start a national survey and ask parents, do you think it's working? Do you need more support? And where can we give you more support? So I think this is a continuous process. It's a long-term process.
Yeah.
And my hope is that eventually one day the term corporal punishment will just disappear from the dictionary because of disuse. That's my dream.
That's my dream too. I really hope that does happen. I really do. In thinking more about the aftermath and the parenting education, so is it possible to parent without force, Laetitia? That's my big question.
This is a heavy one. Unequivocally, yes.
Yes.
No question about it. Social scientists have shown us that physical force does so much harm and is less effective than non-violent discipline. So, and the studies, the mountain is growing. It's a lot. There's so many coming in, and by reputable scientists. So I think that nobody can question that anymore. Yes, it is possible to parent without force and do it well. So I would just like to give you an example. The Maori from New Zealand, the Maori never had any physical discipline or punishment or anything like that as part of their culture. They lived tranquil and peaceful lives. The children enjoyed quiet lives, a quiet existence. Their domestic lives were tranquil. They were never seen to be violent towards their children. Do you know when that started? When the British arrived. So colonization brought with it corporal punishment to a peaceful, tranquil, fun-loving community, an Indigenous community that is now rife with corporal punishment. And rates are better now, but it takes work, education. And I think it would be great if we can go back to before the British came, before colonization, if Indigenous societies can move back to that tranquil and peaceful existence that they had. And so that is why, unequivocally, yes, we can parent without force.
Excellent answer. I completely agree. That's my video series. I am an advocate to help people understand force is not necessary. In fact, our force can be physical, but I also understand doing a lot of parenting interventions that also it can be psychological, it can be emotional. Coercion is pervasive in situations like this. And all that matters though is if the child perceives it. So that's where the impact is. So well, all of us big people making all of these decisions need to do everything we can to reduce what that violent perception might be for children. And I think it's wonderful to hear your confidence, and it's really beautiful that you shared the story of the Maori people. So thank you for that. It's a similar story that I'm doing my own research on in looking at the different nations across Canada and recognizing the traditional parenting and family values and seeing the amount of community and care and peace and collaboration and strong communication and storytelling that was part of the traditional ways of knowing before colonization took over in Canada. And so it is, there's a lot of learning that we can do from that. Is there anything in Alberta? Here we have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission went across Canada and did 1,000 talks. And after this, they talked to Indigenous survivors all across the country. And it was a pivotal time for Canada to learn the truth of our history. From these conversations, the report that came out was called the 94 Calls to Action. Section 43 is call to action number 6 to repeal Section 43 and ban corporal punishment. Is there anything like this in Australia?
Well, first of all, let me say this is an extraordinary call to action. I'm enamored with what you're doing there in Canada. Unfortunately, I don't think we have something similar here in Australia. Like I said, you seem to have mobilized very well in Canada with your joint statement and with this call to action number 6 in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And of course, the work that you're doing with putting everything out there. I think that's great. And this is the kind of mobilization that I hope we can have in Australia as well. I think this is what we need. It needs to be something that we can take civil society with us, and get people involved. And, this is very important. And I would be very happy if we can have something similar in Australia.
Wonderful. That's interesting to hear. It's kind of a relief and a bit of sadness to hear. It's a relief to hear that you see Canada in that light, that we're doing well, because it feels like a very big uphill battle. And then a little bit of sad saying, okay, what about the Indigenous story in Australia? How is that truth being told? And it just makes us realize where we are in our own history and how much work we have to do. And yeah, it is definitely important work. And thank you for your work and the legacy, the academic legacy that you're leaving in your research is so important and so incredibly well put together and comprehensive. So thank you so much, Dr. Greeff, for your time today. I was wondering, do you have anything final that you want to say to anybody out there?
Well, all I can say is thank you for that lovely comment. I would like for parents and politicians to see that we need this change. And if politicians can find the courage to, move forward and in the different states and territories to introduce legislation that will help our country get rid of corporal punishment and put our children first. That is something that I would like to see. And we're working really hard to achieve that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think between Canada and Australia, because of all the similarities, it's good to learn from one another. We see very good things happening in Canada. Your advocacy is extraordinary, and I'm so happy that the Canadians have you, and your compassionate demeanor and the way that you approach this very tricky subject is encouraging. And so with the two countries, I hope that if we show compassion and we work together and we get our civil society mobilized and our politicians, then things can definitely happen. And I'm encouraged by the new generation coming through. You know, they are so aware of human rights and rights violations. And I think 20, 30 years from now, they will not stand for anything like this. So we have to leave them a legacy that gives them the opportunity to move forward and advance human rights in other areas where they don't have to focus on this particular area, which is so archaic and should have been dealt with many years ago.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. You know, it just got me really excited. I'm so fascinated on how to get youth involved in this. And I'm just new in this advocacy world myself. So I do see organizations that have youth participation, like Children's First Canada is doing amazing here. I am so excited about that our future. I'm so excited about our future. Children are amazing, and they are the best advocates from the minute they're out of the gate, right? Like really are. I mean, they're crying and screaming and standing up, making signs. And so our real beacons of light are to listen to the children so I'm really excited you brought that up. Thank you so much for being here. And I can't wait to collaborate with you more and learn more. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody out there for joining us. And please subscribe to this YouTube channel. Our job really just is to spread the word, have conversations that matter. Let people know around you at home, at your work, that it's still legal to hit kids, and that must change. And the way for that to change is for people to talk about it, but also write your MP, write a policy brief, write a brief, send a letter to your senator and even your premiers, wherever you are. But in order for laws to change in countries like Canada and Australia, citizens have to care about it. So it's time to get up, stand up, and act on this. Thank you everybody for being out there, and I can't wait to share more videos with everyone, and take care.
Thank you.